Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. Don't forget, Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. And you can always sign up for our newsletter at www.justenergyradio.com and check out our, in a couple of weeks, 5 years' worth of archives with excellent programming like you've been hearing today. So in the second hour, we have a very, very good friend of the show coming back on because he is just like a prolific writer. I was going to say something else, but I toned down my comment. And so the last time he was on, I suggested that he just put a cot into the Just Energy Radio offices so that I wouldn't have to call him on the phone to have him come on the air because he writes just that much. And so he has a new book out, The Real Men in Black. And so we're going to be speaking with Nick Redfern. And let me introduce him and we'll get him on because we're going to find out about the real men in black, or if there really are men in black, that whole thing. Okay. Originally from England, Nick Redfern is the author of many books on UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, werewolves, and the Loch Ness Monster, paranormal phenomena, conspiracy theories, psychic powers, and Hollywood scandals. His titles include Contactees, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, A Covert Agenda, Strange Secrets, Celebrity Secrets, Body Snatchers in the Desert, and The Man Monkey, to name a few, and then his new book, The Real Men in Black. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio from NickRedfern.com, Nick Redfern. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Hi, Rita. Doing good, thanks. How are you?
I am doing good. And I have to tell you, when I've seen you on TV lately, I think I've seen you on Ancient Aliens, I'm like waving going, I know him.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done a few of those. They actually filmed them all I think I did like 3 or 4 episodes, but everything was sort of filmed in literally like a 1 hour slot or something like that. We just sort of cranked it all out in, one shoot, so to speak.
Well, that sounds like fun. Did they do that here, or did you get to like fly to Hollywood to do that?
It was actually at one of the airports at DFW Airport. One of the hotels at DFW Airport. I think it's the Hyatt Hotel, if I remember correctly.
Well, you could have called me up. I could have walked through the background, like,
there you go.
You don't notice me. I can wave to my mommy. Anyway, so the new book, and actually it's not super new because this came out like right after we had you on the last time when you had your last book out, which I don't remember the title, but if you could remind me and the audience what the title of your last book was.
That would have been the NASA Conspiracies.
That's right. Duh.
Yeah. Yeah, the new one, the Real Men in Black, it's been out a few months now. It's sort of August, something like July, August, something like that. So it's still relatively new. So.
Yeah, it's relatively new, but it came out, I think, a couple of weeks after we had you on the last time, and I'm like, God, I can't even keep up with you. So let me ask, so do you have a new book coming out next week that I need to be aware of?
I actually do. It's called Keep Out, and it deals with each chapter is like on a secret government base with links to UFOs. So there's like an Area 51 chapter, a Hangar 18 chapter, chapter on the Russian Area 51, things like that. So.
Well, we'll have you back on and we'll find out all about that.
And it
down
literally
the road.
is out next week. It literally is out next week.
I was having a psychic moment on you there.
Yeah. It worked.
Okay, so this book is about the Men in Black, and I think most people, when they think about the Men in Black, they think of Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones and, the aliens and the little, memory zapper. I wish I had one of those. But do the Men in Black really exist?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, you're quite right. Most people's first assumptions are, you mentioned Men in Black, you think of Hollywood, Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones. A lot of people don't realize that the movie franchise, and there's actually a third one in the series coming out next year. A lot of people don't realise that the movie franchise was based on a comic book series of the same name. And the comic book series was inspired by people who'd claimed real-life encounters with the Men in Black. So in other words, it was like Hollywood kind of capitalised on a real-life existing mystery that has been sort of really an integral part of the whole UFO phenomenon pretty much since it kicked off in the late 40s, early 1950s. And, it's the Men in Black really, in real life, sort of do appear very similar to in the movies, the black suit, the black tie and the sunglasses and kind of turning up on people's doorsteps and threatening and intimidating them. It's actually not quite as sort of comedy and adventure-based as, the movies, but it's more sort of sinister and almost like gothic. They almost come across as very sinister, almost paranormal in some ways. The Men in Black are described as looking very pale and gaunt and thin-faced, and they kind of sound almost like vampires upgraded for the modern era, so to speak. So there's a lot of weird things to them, but there's like a long history of reports, literally thousands of reports on file now, going back pretty much sort of 60 years or thereabouts.
But why? I mean, in my experience, you hear about the Men in Black tied to conspiracy theory stuff, and it really does sit in the UFO genre, which we're going to talk a little more about also. But why don't you hear about it more in the general public, or is it really kind of isolated to the UFO phenomenon?
Well, I mean, for the most part, the people who get visited by the Men in Black, for the most part, are witnesses to UFOs. There have been probably, sort of 10 or 15 researchers, high-profile researchers and authors, who've experienced Men in Black type visitations and phenomena, and some of the sort of spin-off aspects to the Men in Black visits, like telephone interference and mail interference, that sort of thing. But for the most part, it tends to be eyewitnesses to UFOs or abductees, contactees, people like that. And I think one of the reasons why, when you say, why don't we hear about it more? Why don't we hear more about it from the general public? I think one of the reasons is that a lot of people, particularly today, having a full awareness of the movies, don't want to talk out publicly about this because they worry people are going to say, well, you've overdosed on watching too many Hollywood films. It's almost like, although the Hollywood movies are entertaining and fun to watch, it's almost as if they've, you'd ironically think it would convince more people to come forward and talk about their experiences, which actually had the opposite effect, where people feel that they're just going to be accused of jumping on the bandwagon or just fantasizing that, because they've watched the films or whatever. So I think a lot of people recognize this and are fearful of ridicule and being labeled liars or cranks, and so they don't say anything. And ironically, although we still get a lot of reports today, the vast majority of reports when it was really at its height were in the 50s and 60s, and then when it got more into the public eye, reports tailed off, which is actually opposite to UFO sightings. The more it's spoken about, more people come forward, because I don't think there's so much of a ridicule factor in saying you saw a UFO, even though it's still controversial. I don't think there's as much ridicule as if, saying I saw the Men in Black or got visited by the Men in Black. So.
And we're going to get into some specific stories of encounters that you talk about in the book, but just in the general sense of the word, what do these guys want? Why are they visiting people?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, when you look at the phenomenon of the Men in Black, I won't say exclusively, but almost exclusively, they turn up in relation to UFOs. Now, in saying that, there have been people who have, for example, been dabbling in things like Ouija boards, and they said they got visitations from the Men in Black. The people even investigated things like the Loch Ness Monster and strange creatures like Mothman. They got visited. Now, somebody might argue, well, they're just fringe-type cases that, are sort of on the fringes of the UFO subject, so maybe that's why they might be tied in, which is possible. But the vast majority of people who ever get a visit are people who are deeply involved in the UFO subject or they're witnesses. So in other words, the visitations are somehow linked directly with UFOs. Now the big question is what's the role of the Men in Black? I mean, for the most part, they deeply intimidate people and threaten and frighten them. Contrary to what a lot of people believe or assume, there actually are probably no more than 2 or 3 cases across 60 years where there have been sort of unusual or perceived as being unusual deaths or anything like that associated with Men in Black visits. And even those 2 or 3 are open to interpretation as to whether it really was like a tragic accident. For the most part, the MIB intimidate people and frighten them, and sort of make subtle hints as to what could happen if they don't remain silent. But they very, very rarely, if ever, follow through on that threat. It's almost as if the threat is enough. And the best we can kind of conclude is that, the silencing is done to prevent people learning about the truth and the agenda behind the UFO presence. That seems to be the main thing, to sort of frighten people out of their wits and get them to, if they're researchers, leave their studies behind, and if they're witnesses, not to tell people like us, what they know. So.
Is there a correlation between the Men in Black and what was happening in Roswell after the crash? Because you hear all the stories about the children of somebody that said, these people came to our house and they said, you don't ever talk about this, or we're going to kill your parents or whatever.
Well, I mean, there is a parallel in the sense that obviously, that the threat's the same, and you're getting somebody knocking on your door and sometimes flashing credentials and sometimes not, and saying, about this UFO incident, you will not talk about it. So in that respect, you do have that parallel. But when you look at Roswell, it seems like the silencing and threats were made by military personnel. We can trace it back to the military. The Men in Black seem almost like, some sort of body of individuals who operate outside of government or the military. In other words, you could be silenced by the military or threatened, by an official agency of government for talking about UFOs and, warned not to talk about it. But the Men in Black don't seem to belong to these groups. So, it's kind of like how we define who or what the Men in Black are. And one of the things I point out in the book is that when we look at the overall mystery, I think there are several different categories of Men in Black. In some cases, there are people who happen to have been silenced by FBI, military, Air Force personnel. Other cases, they've been visited and threatened and silenced by genuinely weird Men in Black who don't seem to be traced back to any agency. We're just not sure where they're from. So, the very fact that people have been silenced and threatened, in other words, doesn't necessarily mean the visit came from the literal Men in Black. It could well have been just somebody working on a secret UFO program who, the distinction might seem slight to some people, but there is a big difference between being silenced by the Men in Black and being silenced by somebody in government who happens to wear a dark-coloured suit, if you see what I mean. It's like, it's not quite as clear-cut as that. So.
Well, and that's really interesting. I was in New Mexico for the ASPE conference and got to hang out with Anthony Sanchez, and he was sharing a story, and he's coming on in January, I think.
Oh, cool.
And he was sharing a story about his house being ransacked, and, I don't know, they were just talking about these different occurrences that were happening in their home, in friends' homes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and they were attributing it to the Men in Black. But it sounds like people are just kind of using, listening to you, people are kind of using that terminology to cluster all of the weird stuff.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't think people do it deliberately or maliciously. I don't think it's anything like that. I think, it's natural to assume if you've seen a UFO and somebody threatens you, it's the Men in Black. I tend to take the view that most reports, of somebody being intimidated by somebody who flashes an identity card and they're perhaps dressed in a military uniform or a typical, bureaucratic government look, that's probably who they are from. But these guys kind of look normal. They look intimidating. They look like, how you would expect a military person to look, sort of 6 foot tall, 200 pounds, well built, and trying to intimidate you. The Men in Black, the real Men in Black, are nothing like that. They're kind of very often described as only being like 5 foot to 5'5" tall, very thin, almost like anorexic looking, pale faced to the point of looking, anemic, sunken cheekbones, and they wear these big wraparound sunglasses, and they seem to have oddly spaced and staring eyes behind the sunglasses, which has actually led some people to think that they're, some sort of human-like alien race that subtly camouflages themselves to work their way into our society, and that, if you saw them from 10 feet, 20 feet away, you might not notice a few subtle differences in their appearance. So in other words, there's a clear distinction between the nature of the people or the creatures, however you want to term them, doing the silencing, whether it's human people on the one hand from the military, or these sort of creepier, pale-faced, skinny little guys on the other. So.
Yeah, I mean, a 5 foot tall, scrawny little guy just doesn't sound all that intimidating.
No. Well, I mean, that's actually the interesting thing, because most people say they are intimidated, and the reason most people have said they've felt intimidated is because these sort of little weird-looking guys have creeped them out. It's almost like you know what you're dealing with if you get sort of a 6 foot tall Marine type on your doorstep. But when you get this sort of little 5 foot tall guy with a creepy, eerie stare on his face, just sort of boring his eyes into your head, who looks strange and has got these weird sunken cheeks and, skin the colour of a bottle of milk, people actually have felt more intimidated than you might argue, if there was a police officer sat opposite them, because they kind of exude this air of menace and weirdness that the person finds it difficult to put their finger on. One of the witnesses actually said that throughout the interview with this Man in Black, that the MIB had this look on his face, literally throughout the entire interview, where the woman said it looked like the sort of face that a dog has when it's about to bite you, so like starry-eyed and just sort of, you can tell it was like sort of just, sweating menace or whatever. So a lot of people, they do find it very intimidating because it's so out of the ordinary and unsettling, I think.
And that's kind of interesting. I mean, I believe that everybody has psychic abilities and is able to pick up the vibe off of people they encounter, and if that's what people are responding to is just this bad vibe that these guys are giving off, I think that can be very telling all by itself.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, that woman, the woman who made the point about the dog, I think, that's actually a very good analogy in the sense that, we've all, I'm sure, met somebody at one point who, for whatever reason, you instantly don't like them, or you feel there's something not right about them or disturbing. Do you know what I mean? I think we've all experienced that. And if you imagine that feeling sort of amplified 500%, that's how people feel when they're in the company of the Men in Black. There's just something about them that's very odd and disturbing that often the person can't put their finger on, other than the fact that they look weird and act weird. And maybe that's enough in itself. But, there is also this hard-to-define menace that a lot of people have talked about as well.
They have bad mojo.
Exactly. Well, that's what, you say that, but that's what a lot of people actually think, that, when you talk about mojo and things like that, a lot of people who've met the Men in Black or seen them have actually come to the conclusion, after they've dug into the subject further, that they seem more paranormal or supernatural rather than anything connected, with literal nuts and bolts aliens. People have drawn parallels. For example, with other paranormal phenomena. For example, one of the interesting things about the Men in Black is that, you might imagine if you get a knock 11 o'clock late one Friday night, which is often when the Men in Black turn up, literally that late at night, you would imagine that, from the imagery, they're going to kick the front door down, etc. They don't. What they do, they just stand enigmatically on the doorstep waiting to be invited in. And it's almost like the person goes into a hypnotic trance where they give no thought to the fact that, well, there's these three weird-looking guys on the doorstep at 11 o'clock at night, and I'm just going to let them in. But that's what they do. And people have drawn parallels with the fact in the old vampire legends, the vampire, on the first occasion, can't enter your home unless you're invited in. And they often did that, according to legend, by placing the person into sort of like a semi-hypnotized state. So one of the things I point out in the book, there's not much difference between getting a Friday night visit in 1810, shall we say, or 1820, from a pale-faced, black-dressed vampire who you invite in your home, and a pale-faced, black-suited man in black, in 1990 or something, who you have to invite into your home. The parallels are so close that this has really led a lot of people to think we're dealing with entities that aren't just responsible for sort of silencing people in respect to UFOs, but they almost be like paranormal police in the sense that, they want to shut down any sort of research into any paranormal activity if we get too close to it, which sort of begs the question, are they not aliens or government, but could they be, something from some paranormal realm or dimension?
It just makes me think I need to hang like some garlic in front of my front door.
Might not be a bad idea, actually. Might be a good idea.
And everybody that's listening, if your doorbell rings at 11 o'clock, don't answer it.
Yeah. Well, that is the weird thing. People have said that they just didn't understand. What happens very often is the person opens the door, they see these guys, and instead of slamming it shut or asking for credentials, the man in black will say something like, we understand you had a strange experience last week, we'd like to talk about it. And the person invites them in, they come in, and the person just spills the beans, reels the whole thing off, forgets to ask for ID, and when the men in black are finished or satisfied, they've got all the information, they don't even say goodbye, they just kind of stand up and walk off, in a line, almost like toy soldiers, just walking off in a line out the door. And it's when they're gone, sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes afterwards, it's like the person comes round from anesthetic, where their mind starts to return to normal, and more importantly, their sort of common sense factors kick back in, and they think, well, why the hell did I let that person in? Why didn't I ask for ID? Why didn't I realize it's not normal at 11 o'clock to open the door to three guys who you don't even know? But of course, because it takes like 10 or 15 minutes afterwards, by the time the realization hits home as to what's happened, and they race to the front door, the trail's gone cold, they've already gone. So that's an issue we see in many of these cases, that the people just don't act normally and do the rational things that you would expect them to do, if you're confronted by a bunch of guys on your doorstep late at night.
Like they're in a trance or something.
But that's actually what a lot of people have said. They felt, at the time they didn't realize it, but afterwards, in retrospect, they felt they were rendered into like a hypnotic, trance-like state where, they reeled off all the information the men in black wanted, but their common sense aspect of the mind and everything else was just kind of blocked, and it was only afterwards that they sort of returned to normal, and which again sort of begs the question: do they hold some sort of mental paranormal sway over our mental systems, our brain, etc.?
You hear something similar from abductees.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, in the cases that you've investigated, has there ever been an abductee that has recall that has been visited by the men in black?
Yeah, I've actually got a whole chapter in the book on the abduction angle of the Men in Black mystery, where there've been, for example, one person I talk about in the book actually had an abduction experience and then saw two of these guys stealing her mail from the mailbox, and it was quite funny because she described them as looking like the Blues Brothers. That was the exact word that she used to the investigator. With the sort of the fedora hats, the sunglasses, and the black suit, and she said that's the only way she could think to describe them. They looked like the Blues Brothers, and so she had a visitation. Now, somebody else who I interviewed extensively for the book, because she had her own experience, is an author. I don't know if you've ever had her on your show, named Marie Jones. I don't know if you know Marie.
Marie's been on the show like 4 or 5 times, and that was one of my questions, was like,
oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
What happened to Marie? We love Marie on this show.
Okay, well, I'm sure she can expand on it herself next time she's on the show. But Marie told me quite openly how in the 1990s, when she was living in California, or she still is in California, I should say. She and her friends set up kind of like an alien abduction support group because, a lot of people find abductions, the people undergo them, to be very traumatic experiences. And so, they thought, well, why not just have a group that, instead of just discussing abductions, but we try and help people as well. And so Marina, her friend, another woman, they set this group up, and pretty much in the wake of it being established, strange things began to happen. Marie's friend, who lived in an isolated area in California, her and her husband began seeing these black-suited, shadowy characters lurking around the property in this sort of isolated area in which they were living. And she said, they could see them out the windows, like at the end of the driveway, sort of moving in these weird, jerky, almost like robotic fashion, which sounds really weird. And she got quite intimidated by this. And then that didn't happen to Marie, but what happened to Marie in the wake of the visits that her friend got was that Marie started getting another angle of MIB visitations, which is the sort of mysterious phone calls where people have reported sort of strange electronic voices on the phone threatening and intimidating people. And that's what Marie got. She told me how, late at night, perhaps 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock even, she'd be lying in bed reading a book and the phone would go. And, of course, if the phone goes at that time of night, you automatically think, well, it's got to be bad news. So, you pick it up and answer it just in case. And when she did, she said this happened on a number of occasions. She would hear this weird sort of icy cold mechanical type voice, which would, it wouldn't ask questions, it wouldn't threaten her, but it would just sort of reel off like facts. Facts like which room in the house she was in, what she was wearing, which book she was reading, that sort of thing. Now, it was just done, obviously, as Marie believes, to intimidate her, to let her know that, hey, not only are we watching you, we can watch your every movement and know what you're doing at any given time. And collectively, this sort of really intimidated Marie and her friend to the point where they were like, no, enough's enough, and they'd walked away from the abduction subject, which probably, I think, in retrospect, and as I note in the book, and as I think Marie agrees as well, was probably the whole point of the exercise, that they hit on something, I think, significant about abductions that, a lot of people do abduction research, but they don't get silenced by the Men in Blacks. So I think there was probably something, or a witness, or an experience of that sort of thing that they were dealing with that was a really significant case that somebody or something wanted them kept away from, and unfortunately it worked. They both backed away from the subject. So.
All right, that's just really kind of creepy.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, a number of the stories, and I have some other questions about that, but just, kind of bringing it to the present, in the 90s, it's like, I'm trying to think back. It almost seems like so long ago, but it wasn't. Caller ID was something I think you still had to pay for, so people really didn't have it, and you didn't have, like your recorder on your cell phone and your video camera, but have people still been having situations, and have they been able to utilize some of this very handy technology that we have access to now to kind of run interference or collect some evidence or to record a weird phone call or series of phone calls?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, over time, the methods and, systems that the Men in Black use has actually changed. Although we still get sort of weird hang-up phone calls and strange sort of electronic noises on phones and things like that, for the most part, the phone intimidation, was really at its height in the 60s and 70s, and it actually has tailed off today. People get the visits still, but the cases like Marie's are actually with actual literal phone interference and intimidation are few and far between. They're far less than they were in the 60s and 70s. So you could argue maybe that is purely and simply because, we do have things like caller ID, and it is far easier to, track people down, where even if necessary, we could ask the relevant phone company to, in a legal situation to find out where all the incoming phone calls were coming from. Courts sometimes do that, in things like murder cases or whatever. So, I think that's an important point, that we actually have something in our favor. Most of the time, I think we're quite justified in worrying about the way in which, surveillance of our phones goes on, etc. But maybe in this respect, you could argue that it's useful.
Hey, can you still hear me, Nick?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah. No, I mean, you're talking about the phone interference, and it was just like...
Oh, no. Oh, that's wild.
I'm like, wait, they're listening. They're listening.
Well, you see, I mean, the thing is, a lot of people assume, for example, like the movies, when you see, like, the hero in the film, they say, keep the guy on the phone for 2 minutes, we've got to trace the call. The reality is, with today's technology, they don't need to keep somebody talking for 2 or 3 minutes. That's just to amp up the suspense for the film. It takes no time with today's technology. And also, there's no reason, if you hear strange voices or strange cracklings or anything like that on the phone, there's no reason why that has to be. Certainly in years past, decades past, when wiretaps were put on phones, it did cause interference. But today, the technology is totally different. The days of sort of breaking into somebody's house or the junction box and, at the end of the street and put in a tap on somebody's phone. It's not done like that anymore. A lot of people, you have wireless connection, etc., etc. So in other words, if people are hearing weird interference on the phones and things like that, then chances are somebody's tweaking something at the other end to try and provoke intimidation to let the person know. It's like a good sort of psychological warfare tactic, If the person doesn't know they're being watched, they don't feel there's anything to worry about. You put the thought in their mind that we're watching you, then they worry. So how do you do that? You've got to let them know they're being listened to or watched.
Yeah, it makes you just a little bit paranoid.
Well, I think a little bit of paranoia is not a bad thing. But joking aside, there are people in the Men in Black research field, who've just gone plain nuts because they've become so paranoid. It's like every black car that goes past the house, at a slow speed, it's the Men in Black. Chances are, for the most part, it's somebody not sure which street they're on. They're looking for somewhere to go to see somebody who's, they've not visited before. They're looking for the house. It's you can easily understand how somebody who's had a traumatic experience with the Men in Black might find, from a psychological perspective, that they get really sort of freaked out and weirded out by every little thing that goes on. All of us at some point have, dialed a number to call someone, and we've realised at the last minute, we dialed the wrong number, so you hang up before the person answers it. Well, we've all done that, and there's nothing sinister about that. But you imagine if you're a Man in Black witness and that happens, you can understand why some people might be inclined to think, that's telephone interference. It may be just somebody dialed the wrong number, after a night down the pub or whatever, misdialed a 6 for a 4 or whatever, who knows.
Let's talk about a couple of these cases. Do you know when the first encounter, we talked about Roswell and that this whole thing started or seems to have started after Roswell. Yeah. Do you know when the first encounter with the Men in Black happened and what happened?
Yes, I do. I would probably, more than anybody else, the one man who was almost single-handedly, if not single-handedly, kind of ushered in the well-known era of the Men in Black, at least, was a man named Albert Bender. Now, as I said, certainly 47 to 52, we did get reports of people being silenced in relation to UFO encounters, but I think this was more just sort of straightforward Cold War military activities, and at the time, I don't actually blame the military for watching people because, this was a new phenomenon. Nobody really knew where it was going to lead or what was going to happen. And so, if you're in the military and your job is to keep tabs on this new phenomenon that's being seen in the skies, sometimes, people might sort of overstep the line, and as much as I want the truth and, I want to know the answers to what the government knows, I do have kind of like an understanding of why some of these tactics might have been employed. If you look back and think, well, if I was in the military and, you've been briefed on the fact that UFOs exist and, it could be a potential threat, what are we going to do? You can understand why steps may have been taken that comes across as intimidation. But in terms of the literal Men in Black mystery, that really kicked off in 1952 with this guy, Albert Bender. And Albert Bender, at the time, in 52, was living in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And he set up a UFO group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And basically, this was sort of like, any number of groups in any number of cities and towns all across, not just the U.S., but, throughout the world. Most cities and towns have, I guess, like a little paranormal or UFO group. You can go along to monthly meetings, etc. And that's what Albert Bender did. He set up this group, the International Flying Saucer Bureau. But Bender's group, for reasons that we're never really sure of, for some reason, it sort of really captured the public's attention, not just in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he lived, but also throughout the U.S. and even the world. And before Bender knew it, there were people wanting to set up like chapters and offshoots of the group in England and Australia, and it had developed a huge network to the point where he was really sort of answering mail by the sackload on a nightly basis after work. And he did this, for like 6-8 months, and then suddenly he closed the group down without any warnings at all. And this was by the time, the group had reached sort of almost like stratospheric proportions in terms of publicity and subscribers to his newsletter, etc. And Bender alluded to a couple of friends in the UFO field that he got a visit from these three mysterious guys, but he said, well, don't tell anyone, which was the worst thing he could probably have done, because before he knew it, they had mentioned it to other friends and colleagues, and then they passed the story on to somebody else, and it got a little bit mutated and changed each time the story got spread. So, in other words, the cat was out of the bag. Now, a lot of people assume that Bender's Men in Black were, actually a guy in 1956 named Gray Barker wrote a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, and in Barker's book, he described the Men in Black as being representatives, one of the FBI, the CIA, and one of the Air Force, because Bender said he got visited by 3 Men in Black. And for some reason, they often travel in threes. We don't know why that is. And so, the assumption from the early 50s onwards was that Bender was silenced and shut down the group because he got, a government visit, which may well have been the case. We're not really sure to this day, because Bender quit the scene. But he briefly resurfaced in 1962 when Gray Barker, who wrote the earlier book, published, because Barker was a publisher as well, he published Bender's own book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. In Bender's 1962 book, the Men in Black are very, very different to the rumours that were floating around in the early 50s about his experiences. In his book, he describes them in sort of this weird category that I talked about earlier, like these vampire-type characters. For example, he would talk about how he'd be sitting at home. This was another weird thing about Bender. He actually lived in the attic of a creepy old house in Bridgeport, which kind of looked like the house straight out of Psycho. It was like a big old sort of 3-story mansion-type place. Bender said that he would, on a number of occasions in 52, he'd be sort of working in the attic, and he would be overcome by this weird feeling of like dizziness combined with vertigo and nausea, and he would go lightheaded and faint, and he would have to lie down. And he said when he would do that, there would be this overpowering smell of like brimstone enter the room, and suddenly these 3 shadowy Men in Black would manifest in the room, kind of like, spectral vampires or something like that, and they would sort of surround him and warn him, not to talk about UFOs, etc., and then sort of vanish as mysteriously as they'd arrived. And Bender's book actually comes across far less like the X-Files and far more like H.P. Lovecraft meets Count Dracula or something like that. It's almost like if you imagine, somebody investigating UFOs, but where the whole experience of the person is dominated by sort of occult gothic type phenomenon rather than visitations from the government. That's how Bender's story comes across. So, in other words, with Gray Barker's book about Bender in 1956 and then Bender's own book in 62, which kind of contradicted what Barker wrote about him, because Barker was just writing what he'd been told by other people, not from Bender, so to speak. These 2 books really kind of set the scene and open people's eyes to the fact that, that there is a real Men in Black mystery. So, in other words, Bender was the guy who started it, but probably without Gray Barker, it certainly wouldn't have attracted the interest and fascination and become part of pop culture in the way that it did do after that. So.
One of the things that I found interesting, and I'd like to do a follow-up on this Bender story, is that in the book you talk about how he talks about underground bases and aliens extracting substances from seawater, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Has anyone taken either what he talked about in his book and evaluated or reevaluated based on contemporary knowledge to see if there's any credibility or any parallels that other people are experiencing from their claims?
Well, I guess about the closest, really, is, people who've drawn parallels. Bender said that on one occasion, this is where it gets into really controversial areas. He said when he was in this altered state of mind in the bedroom, he claimed to have been, astrally transferred to, a UFO. Not physically transferred, but, his astral spirit or soul. And taken to, in a disembodied form to, but still, he said he kind of looked normal. He had a body when he looked at himself, but it was almost like he felt he'd been astrally transferred to a UFO, which was then taken to an underground base at the South Pole, which, is highly controversial. But that's what Bender claimed. Now, of course, the closest analogies today are, a lot of attention is given in the UFO field to so-called underground alien base stories. We get a lot of these accounts, and admittedly there are a number of these stories coming from, the South Pole and the North Pole. Now, whether or not these stories are true, that's the big question, but, Bender was somebody, again, who, ironically, probably set the scene for a lot of, the imagery that underground base type scenarios involving UFOs actually create and nurture. So in that sense, he was probably a bigger force than he actually realized within the UFO field in terms of the development of different aspects of the subject. But, as I said, not just the Men in Black, but underground bases and the idea that, aliens were coming here because that it was for resources. People talk about abductions being done to secure DNA and eggs and sperm, that sort of thing, to save the alien race or whatever. Bender's, was a little bit different, but it was still, 50, 60 years ago, talking about aliens coming here not to invade us or destroy us, but for resources, that we were kind of like a food source, if you like, and ready to be exploited, and, they were coming here to get what they wanted. So.
Yeah, and that was kind of my thought was, were other people just kind of taking his stuff and adding their stuff on it? Or, because it kind of, time frame-wise, is real early, like the Betty and Barney Hill stuff. Yeah. Where it's not like they stole it from somebody.
No. It's difficult to say. This is one of the big problems with the whole Men in Black mystery, and I would say that the Men in Black mystery is probably one of the most problematic ones of all, because it began so long ago. Most of the early players are now dead. Gray Barker's dead. Bender just vanished. Literally, he was last seen in something like the early 1980s, but he left ufology behind. He was just seen another totally different situation. Since then, he just has not resurfaced at all, just vanished to the wind, so to speak. So, in other words, it's very problematic. When you ask, your question about have other people just taken stuff from here and there, it's difficult to say, because on the one hand, you could argue it sounds like that, but then we find other old cases where somebody else was reporting a very similar thing to Bender, and who clearly didn't know Bender. And this is even before his story was published. So, in other words, it was like there was sort of an undercurrent of certain themes and ideas relative to UFOs were being talked about, were being discussed, people were having experiences independently. So, in that sense, I don't think we can sort of lay the blame or, point the finger of the point of origin at Bender. I think it more likely was the case that he just happened to go public and his story attracted a lot of publicity, but there could have been a lot of other people with very similar accounts who just never went public, or just didn't, I guess, attract the appeal that Bender's story did.
Yeah, and I wasn't pointing a finger. I was just saying, okay, so he said this stuff and have other people come out with similar stuff.
Well,
you know,
I mean, the best thing I can say, or the most significant thing, is that Bender was the first person to talk about how the Men in Black seemed to render him into like an altered state of mind in the experiences. You know, it wasn't just a guy like General or Lieutenant Colonel, whoever, knocking on the door and flashing an ID card. You know, Bender talked about this experience of the Men in Black appearing and then him going into an altered state of mind when they would talk to him, which is very, very similar to what we get today with people, you know, this sort of logic going out of their mind, the common sense factor just vanishing and letting the Men in Black in the house. You know, I'm pretty sure, because Bender's book was a self-published, very obscure title, I'm pretty sure, you know, 99.9% of the Men in Black, of the witnesses to the Men in Black, never read Bender's book.
They never read it.
Never read Bender's book. You know, even within ufology, it's actually not that easy a book to find, and, you know, copies sell for a lot of dollars. So in that respect, you know, I think it's interesting that he sort of, I don't believe he invented it. I think he really experienced this altered state of mind when the Men in Black appeared. If we did get any reports post-Bender along those lines, you could maybe say, well, it was a fantasy or he made it up or whatever. But the very fact that 60 years later people are still having their minds altered as the Men in Black appear, that to me suggests, you know, that he had some valid experiences of some sort. Now, what was at the heart of them, you know, that's the bigger issue. So.
Right. You often hear stories of the Men in Black, and you touched on this briefly, but I want to come back to it, about strange, unusual, or untimely death. Does your research reveal that happens with the Men in Black phenomena, or is that more government stuff?
Well, you know, I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, people think ufologists are different. You know, at the end of the day, we're all human. You know, and unfortunately, we're all on a time limit, and, you know, hopefully a long time limit. But, you know, I think there's often a tendency when somebody in the UFO field of prominence dies, it's like, well, you know, they didn't just die because they're a ufologist. You know, there was something sinister behind it. Now, maybe in some cases you could argue that. For example, Morris Jessup, who was a high-profile researcher in the 50s who wrote a number of very good books on UFOs and links with things like the pyramids and ancient mysteries. He died in 1959 under questionable circumstances when he was supposedly about to announce a big breakthrough in the field, and he was found dead 24 hours later in his car with a pipe from his exhaust into the car in a park in Florida. So, you know, in that respect, you know, we have examples where there could have been an unusual death within the UFO field. And I don't dispute, don't get me wrong, I'm not mocking that or putting it down at all. I don't deny that could have happened on a couple of occasions. But I think we need to sort of balance that out with a realization that, you know, very often somebody in the field who dies because they're a human being, you know, not because they're a UFO researcher. You know, and I think, you know, we need to sort of balance how we look at it so we don't go into the paranoid mode of thinking that everybody in ufology who dies, you know, was silenced. I don't deny it as a possibility, and as I said, there are certain cases like Jessup's that are still highly controversial, but, you know, we do need to have care and balance, I think.
Well, but even with what you said earlier about, you know, there's the Men in Black phenomena, and then there's, you know, I'm going to say more of the black ops stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, because you hear, you know, through, you know, regarding the government and political candidates and stuff, you know, about assassinations or these fast-acting cancer or whatever. And so it doesn't mean, even in the cases that you've just discussed, that it wasn't necessarily even a government thing shutting them up.
No, that's again, you know, that's one of the issues with the Men in Black as to why it becomes controversial, is because it can lead your mind thinking down all these different pathways, which many could well be valid. You know, it's like a sort of a weird hall of mirrors type situation where, you know, I think more than any other aspect of the UFO phenomenon, I think the Men in Black mystery is really one that you can get pulled into a deeply unsettling level and see conspiracies within conspiracies and shadows within shadows and, you know, motivations within motivations. And it can become a real swirling, paranoid mess in your mind. But at the core of it, there is something genuine. And I think that comes into play, you know, with the deaths angle and the murders, that, you know, when we sweep away the swirling sort of cauldron of paranoia that's built up around it, there are genuine cases that do fall into that category. But, you know, the sheer strangeness of the MIB reports, unfortunately for us trying to filter it all out, ensures that, you know, really it's difficult to know how far we should dig and where we should dig. So.
Nick, this hour has gone too fast. We have about 5 minutes left. So let's go here. We touched on it briefly, but what do you think, or who do you think the Men in Black are?
Well, you know, I think some cases can be, you know, explained as government people, particularly back in the 50s, you know, when the guys who worked for the FBI, you know, they wore the black suits and the ties and the fedoras. That was the mode of dress that men wore back then. So some of them, I think, were legitimate, you know, FBI or whoever, military personnel in plain clothes, legitimately going out because they were tasked to do so, because they're part of some sort of UFO project. You know, I'm absolutely sure of that. Others, you know, could be sort of mistaken identity. We know there have been a few hoaxes, but when we filter those out, we're left with a significant number of these very, very, very weird, you know, these pale, strangely eyed-looking guys in the black suits, you know, the real Men in Black. My personal view is that I think there are distinct paranormal overtones to a lot of these experiences. Now, I guess it depends how we define the paranormal. You know, is it a realm or is it a branch of science we don't understand yet that explains paranormal phenomena? We just don't know. But I think the real Men in Black are sort of, you know, I think they're possibly something like interdimensional. I think their role is to prevent us getting too close to the truth, not just about UFOs, but about a whole range of paranormal phenomena. And I think the extent to which they intrude upon our lives and our research is relative to how close the relevant person, knowingly or unknowingly, is getting to the truth. You know, it's like, for example, a lot of Roswell researchers have never been intimidated or silenced, but you could argue that that's the most important case of all. But there could be one person who really hits on something very significant about Roswell that dictates that they then get the visit. So in other words, it's not just people being visited left, right, and centre all over the place. It's when they hit on something important, which could blow the whole thing wide open. And I think that's when the Men in Black appear. Now, you know, are they the guardians of outer space or some other realm or dimension? I'm kind of inclined to think it's the latter, like a dimensional entities that coexist with us, that flit in and out of our reality when we get too close to whatever it is they want us kept away from. So in that sense, you know, I do believe they're real. What they are, you know, is open to question, but that's kind of my view, some sort of interdimensional paranormal entity tasked with sort of policing the whole UFO issue, if you like.
Okay, but said another way, and I'll just kind of cringe as I say this, but that would mean that they were aliens.
Well, aliens in the sense that they're not from here, you know.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, are they extraterrestrial? Are they interdimensional? Some people even think, you know, they're like time travelers from the future or something like that. You know, a lot of different theories, and of course, you know, have these vampire overtones that give it sort of a supernatural quality. And maybe, you know, as I point out in the book, there could be several different explanations. I mean, there are, for example, evidence that maybe at times the government, to protect hitch tracks, has actually masqueraded as these weirder Men in Black. They actually sent their guys out to act in strange ways and, you know, to sort of spread like a meme, you know, the notion of the stranger Men in Black, to protect the fact that some of them are from the government, which is kind of an ingenious little psychological ploy, if you like. You know, how are we going to prevent people finding out who we are? Oh, well, you know, let's exploit those myths of these strange Men in Black. You know, you can imagine the sort of situation sitting in the Pentagon thinking that, you know, but logically it would work. So I think, you know, it's such an enigmatic mystery because it's not just one thing, you know, and that's what makes it puzzling as well. So.
Yeah, but it makes it fascinating.
Well,
Just
it does,
fascinating.
that's right.
Well, Nick, the music's going to come up here in a second, so I just
Okay.
want to thank you again for coming on the show, and I guess I will pop you an email about
Alrighty.
you coming back on to talk about your new book entitled
Keep Out, and it's a study of
Keep Out.
secret bases with links and installations with links to UFOs like Area 51 and Hangar 18.
Keep Out. But today we talked about the real Men in Black.
Yes, we did.
And people can learn more if they buy the book. Woo!
They can.
All right, Nick, I'm going to let you go, and I will talk to you again soon.
All right, thanks, Rita. See you later.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
That's Nick Redfern. His website is nickredfern.com. The book we talked about was The Real Men in Black. Really interesting topic. Next week, we're going to be speaking with Stephen Mailer about the people of the Great Pyramid. So, until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita.